February 20th, 1942, Rabaul, New Britain. The tropical sun hung like molten copper over Simpson Harbor, its light fracturing across waters so blue it seemed painted rather than real. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch stood on the deck of the USS Lexington, a wooden matchstick rotating slowly between his fingers. Around him the Pacific spread in all directions, deceptively peaceful, impossibly vast, and somewhere within that immensity, Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters prowled like sharks through blue water. Thatch's mind was not on the beauty surrounding him. It was focused entirely on the matchstick, on the way two small pieces of wood could be manipulated to demonstrate a principle that might, just might, keep his pilots alive long enough to matter. The stick turned again, crossed with another, separated, rejoined. A simple motion, a child's game with wooden matches. But in Thatch's imagination, those matches were Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, and the pattern they traced through the air was nothing less than a geometric solution to what seemed an unsolvable problem: how to fight an enemy aircraft superior in every measurable performance characteristic and win. 3,000 miles to the east, in offices and training facilities across the United States, naval aviators studied performance specifications with growing dread. The reports from China, from the Philippines, from the scattered and desperate early engagements of the Pacific War, all told the same story. The Zero was not just good, it was revolutionary. It could outclimb any American fighter. It could outturn anything in the Allied inventory. Its range was so extraordinary that Allied intelligence initially refused to believe it, assuming the aircraft must be operating from hidden forward bases because no single-engine fighter could possibly fly so far. Japanese pilots, veterans of combat in China, and intensively trained in aggressive tactics, flew these magnificent machines with skill that bordered on artistry. They dominated the skies over the Pacific with such complete superiority that American pilots were beginning to wonder if the war in the air could be won at all. To understand the revolution that Thatch's matchstick represented, one must first understand the depths of American despair in the early months of 1942. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the Pacific Fleet's battleship force. The Philippines were falling despite desperate resistance. Wake Island had been overwhelmed. Guam was lost. Singapore would fall to the Japanese in days. Everywhere across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Allied forces were in retreat, and nowhere was Allied inferiority more apparent than in the air. The Zero had achieved a mystique that transcended its actual capabilities. It was spoken of in terms usually reserved for supernatural phenomena, as if Japanese engineers had violated the laws of physics to create an aircraft that simply could not be beaten in aerial combat. The numbers seemed to support this perception. The Zero weighed barely 5,300 pounds fully loaded, extraordinarily light for a fighter aircraft. This low weight, combined with a powerful Nakajima-Sakai radial engine and large wing area, gave the Zero a rate of climb and turning radius that American pilots found literally incredible when they first encountered it in combat. A Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in roughly 16 seconds at optimal speed. The F-4F Wildcat, standard American carrier fighter in early 1942, required nearly 22 seconds for the same maneuver. In a turning fight, the classic dogfight engagement that defined aerial combat since World War I, this difference was absolutely decisive. A Zero could get inside an American turn, position for a killing shot, and destroy the Wildcat before the American pilot could even bring his guns to bear. The Zero's armament was equally formidable. Two 20mm cannon mounted in the wings provided devastating hitting power, supplemented by two 7.7mm machine guns. American pilots reported that a single burst from a Zero's cannon could tear a Wildcat apart. The explosive shells did not simply puncture. They detonated, shredding aluminum and destroying critical systems with horrifying efficiency. Meanwhile, the Wildcats' 650 caliber machine guns, while effective when hits were achieved, required sustained fire to bring down an aircraft. In the crucial first seconds of engagement, when surprise and positioning determined outcomes, the Zero's cannon gave Japanese pilots an enormous advantage. Japanese pilot training compounded these technical advantages. The naval aviators flying Zeros in early 1942 were among the most experienced combat pilots in the world. Many had flown combat missions in China, where they had refined their tactics against Chinese opposition that, while brave, was equipped with obsolete aircraft and hampered by inadequate training. Japanese pilots had developed an aggressive fighting style that emphasized individual initiative and offensive action. They were trained to dogfight, to maneuver, to use their aircraft's superior performance to dictate the terms of engagement. And they had absolute confidence in their equipment and their skills, a confidence reinforced by victory after victory in the war's opening months. American pilots facing Zeros in early 1942 were, by contrast, often inadequately prepared for the reality of combat against a superior enemy. Peacetime training had emphasized formation flying and gunnery, but had not anticipated facing an enemy with better aircraft and more experienced pilots. The tactical doctrine inherited from interwar years assumed American technological superiority, that American fighters would be faster, better armed, more maneuverable than any potential enemy. The Zero invalidated every one of these assumptions simultaneously. American pilots found themselves flying aircraft that couldn't climb as fast, couldn't turn as tight, couldn't run away, and were flown by an enemy who had already proven his skill and determination in combat. The psychological impact of this situation cannot be overstated. Pilots are inherently confident people. The nature of the profession demands it. But confidence must be grounded in capability, and early encounters with Zeros were destroying that foundation systematically. American pilots who survived engagements with Zeros reported feeling helpless, outmatched, doomed to lose any fight that developed into a turning engagement. Some began to advocate for defensive tactics, tight formations, mutual support, avoiding combat when possible. But this was psychologically devastating in ways that went beyond tactical disadvantage. Fighter pilots are, by temperament and training, aggressive, telling them to fly defensively to avoid combat, to survive rather than seek out and destroy the enemy, was asking them to abandon the fundamental ethos of their profession. Into this crisis of confidence and capability stepped Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch, a fighter squadron commander whose mind worked in ways that combined practical experience with geometric intuition. Thatch had not yet faced Zeros in combat. The early months of 1942 found him training replacement pilots and pondering the problem that was keeping every American fighter commander awake at night. How do you fight an enemy with a better aircraft? How do you overcome technical inferiority through tactical innovation? How do you win when every performance metric favors your opponent? Thatch's genius was recognizing that the question itself was flawed. You could not overcome the Zero's superior turning performance by trying to outturn it. That way led only to defeat and death. But you could potentially neutralize the Zero's turning advantage by refusing to fight the battle on the terms that favored Japanese tactics. The Zero was optimized for solo dogfighting, for one-on-one maneuvering combat where its agility was decisive. What if American fighters refused to fight one-on-one? What if, instead of individual aircraft trying to defeat individual Zeros, American pilots fought as integrated teams where the unit of combat was not the individual plane, but a pair of aircraft working in perfect coordination? This was not an entirely new concept. Fighter tactics had long recognized the value of wingmen and mutual support. But Thatch envisioned something more systematic, more geometric in its precision. He imagined two pairs of aircraft, 4 planes total, divided into 2 sections of leader and wingman, flying parallel courses, separated by roughly 2,000 feet. If Zeros attacked one section, that section would turn toward the attacking enemy. Simultaneously, the other section would turn toward the first section. The result would be that the two American sections would pass head-on, crossing paths with the attacking Zeros caught between them. The geometry was elegant. A Zero pursuing an American fighter would find itself flying directly toward another American fighter coming from the opposite direction. The Zero pilot would face an instantaneous decision: continue pursuit and risk head-on guns from the second American section, or break off pursuit to avoid that threat. Either choice negated the Zero's turning advantage. If the Zero continued pursuit, it exposed itself to frontal attack from the crossing American section. If it broke off, the pursued American section gained time to reposition or escape. And if the Zero tried to turn with the American sections as they crossed, it would find itself inside a rotating geometric trap, where American aircraft were always positioned to threaten any Japanese pilot who committed to pursuing a single target. Thach worked out this tactic using models. Initially just his hands, later wooden matches that could be manipulated to demonstrate the crossing pattern, and eventually clay models of aircraft that he moved across a table in his stateroom while other pilots watched and tried to find flaws in the concept. He called it the beam defense position, though it would later become universally known by a more descriptive name, the Thach weave. The name captured the essence of the tactic perfectly. American fighters would weave back and forth across each other's paths, creating a defensive pattern that turned individual vulnerability into collective strength. The theory was elegant. The challenge was making it work in practice. Fighter combat occurs at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, with aircraft maneuvering in 3 dimensions, with visibility limited by cockpit frames and the fundamental difficulty of spotting small aircraft against vast sky. Pilots are subjected to gravitational forces during turns that narrow vision and impair judgment. Radio communication in 1942 was primitive by modern standards, scratchy, unreliable, easily jammed or lost in the chaos of combat. Expecting pilots to execute precision geometric maneuvers while under attack by enemy fighters who were actively trying to kill them required not just understanding the theory but drilling it until the movements became instinctive. Thach trained his pilots relentlessly. They flew the weave pattern again and again, first in clear weather with no opposition, then with friendly aircraft simulating enemy attacks, then under progressively more realistic conditions that approximated the chaos and stress of actual combat. Pilots who initially thought the tactic was too complicated, too difficult to execute under stress, gradually internalized the movements until they became automatic. Turn toward your partner when attacked. Cross head-on. Separate and turn back. Weave again. The pattern was simple in concept but demanded absolute trust between pilots. A section leader had to trust that his wingman would be where he was supposed to be. A wingman had to trust that his leader would not abandon him. Both had to trust that the geometry would work, that the weave would neutralize enemy advantages, that this strange defensive dance would keep them alive long enough to hurt the enemy. The first test of the Thach weave in actual combat came on April 10, 1942, during operations near New Guinea. Thach was leading a division of 4 Wildcats, himself and his wingman, plus a second section led by Lieutenant Commander Don Lovelace. They encountered a formation of Japanese aircraft, including several Zeros. The engagement developed exactly as Thach had theorized. Zeros, seeing numerically inferior American fighters, attacked aggressively. Thach's division began weaving. Zeros that committed to pursuing one section found themselves facing head-on attacks from the other section. Japanese pilots trained for individual maneuvering combat found themselves in a geometric trap where their superior turning performance was neutralized by American mutual support. The engagement was not a clear-cut American victory. Fighter combat rarely produces unambiguous outcomes where all enemies are destroyed and all friendlies returned safely. But Thach's division survived against superior numbers of technically superior aircraft, shot down at least one Zero confirmed and damaged others, and returned to the carrier intact. More importantly, they had proven that the weave worked. It was not just theory or wishful thinking. It was a practical tactic that could be executed under combat conditions and would neutralize the Zero's most dangerous advantage. Word of the engagement spread rapidly through the fighter community. Pilots who had been facing Zeros with growing dread suddenly had a tactic that offered hope. The weave could not make the Wildcat perform like a Zero. The fundamental performance differences remained unchanged. But it could make those differences irrelevant by refusing to fight the kind of engagement where Japanese advantages were decisive. American pilots began training in the weave. Squadron commanders incorporated it into tactical doctrine. By mid-1942, as American carrier forces prepared for the critical Battle of Midway, the Thach weave had become standard tactics for Wildcat pilots facing Zero opposition. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 provided the ultimate test. Thach himself flew in the battle, leading a fighter division protecting American torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carrier fleet. The engagement was chaotic, desperate, and devastating. Japanese Zeros, defending their carriers from American attack, tore into American torpedo squadrons with savage effectiveness. Of 15 torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, 14 were shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the ocean while the battle raged around him. The slaughter of American torpedo bombers at Midway was one of the most one-sided aerial massacres of the war. But Thach's fighter division, flying the weave pattern, survived and fought effectively. Zeros attempting to break through to finish off damaged American bombers found themselves engaged by Wildcats that refused to dogfight, instead weaving in mutually supporting pairs that negated Japanese maneuvering advantages. Thach's own after-action report noted the tactic's effectiveness in starkest terms. The beam defense maneuver was used repeatedly with great success. Zeros making runs on any member of the formation found themselves constantly threatened by aircraft from the opposite section. Several Zeros broke off attacks rather than face head-on engagement. One Zero was destroyed attempting to turn inside our weave. He was caught between sections and took fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. That last observation was critical. The weave did not just protect American aircraft, it created opportunities to destroy Japanese aircraft. A Zero caught inside the weave, committed to pursuing one American fighter while another American section crossed head-on, was in the most vulnerable position possible. It could not turn quickly enough to engage both threats simultaneously. It could not continue pursuit without accepting frontal attack. And if it tried to escape by diving or climbing, it exposed itself to deflection shots from both American sections. The weave transformed what had been individual vulnerability into collective lethality. The psychological impact of the weave on both sides was profound. For American pilots, it provided something desperately needed in early 1942, a way to fight Zeros without accepting inevitable defeat. The weave restored confidence, not through denying reality, but through adapting to it. American pilots could acknowledge that the Zero was more maneuverable while simultaneously recognizing that maneuverability could be neutralized through superior tactics and teamwork. The sense of helplessness that had characterized early encounters with Zeros evaporated, replaced by aggressive confidence grounded in practical tactical solutions. For Japanese pilots, the appearance of the weave was deeply disorienting. Their training had emphasized individual skill and aggressive pursuit. The entire philosophy of Zero employment assumed that superior performance would allow Japanese pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. But American pilots flying the weave refused to accept those terms. They would not dogfight one-on-one. They would not allow themselves to be isolated and destroyed individually. Instead, they fought as integrated teams that turned Japanese aggression into vulnerability. Zero pilots found themselves in situations they had not trained for, facing coordinated defense that punished the very tactics that had brought success against Chinese and early American opposition. A Japanese pilot's report recovered after the war captured this confusion. The American fighters refused to fight properly. They do not maneuver individually but always in pairs, weaving back and forth. When we attack one, another threatens from a different angle. When we turn to engage the threat, the first aircraft has repositioned. They are not fighting like fighter pilots. They are fighting like bombers in defensive formation. It is frustrating and effective. We shoot down fewer than we should given our aircraft's superiority. That phrase, "they are not fighting like fighter pilots," revealed the fundamental philosophical difference the weave represented. Japanese fighter doctrine was grounded in the samurai tradition of individual martial excellence. A fighter pilot was a warrior, and his worth was measured by personal skill in combat. The idea of subordinating individual initiative to collective tactical formation was alien to this philosophy. But American military culture, derived from democratic rather than martial traditions, had no such philosophical objection to teamwork superseding individual glory. If fighting as an integrated team was more effective than fighting as individual warriors, then American pilots would fight as teams. The objective was to win, not to demonstrate personal martial virtue. This cultural difference manifested in aircraft design as well as tactics. The Zero's extraordinary performance came at a cost: minimal armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and light structural design that made the aircraft vulnerable to damage. Japanese designers had consciously chosen to maximize performance by minimizing weight, accepting increased vulnerability as the price of superior maneuverability. This design philosophy assumed that pilot skill would avoid hits, and that superior performance would allow Japanese pilots to dictate engagement terms. The Wildcat, by contrast, was designed with survivability in mind. It had armor protecting the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without catastrophic fire. Its structure was robust enough to absorb battle damage and still fly home. American designers had accepted reduced performance in exchange for increased durability. The weave exploited this design difference brilliantly. In a one-on-one turning fight, the Zero's superior maneuverability outweighed the Wildcat's superior durability. The Zero would get the killing shot before American armor mattered. But the weave prevented one-on-one engagements from developing. Instead, it created situations where multiple aircraft engaged the same target, where head-on passes rather than turning fights determined outcomes, where the battle became one of attrition rather than individual skill. In this kind of engagement, the Wildcat's armor and structural strength became decisive advantages. Wildcats could take hits that would destroy Zeros and continue fighting. Zero pilots who scored hits on Wildcats were horrified to see their targets continue flying, while single bursts from Wildcat guns could set a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks ablaze. The matchstick that Thatch had rotated between his fingers became, in this context, a symbol of something larger than just a tactical innovation. It represented the democratization of aerial combat. Fighter warfare had always been an elite activity, dominated by aces whose individual skill determined outcomes. But the weave made average pilots fighting as disciplined teams as effective as, or more effective than, individually superior enemy pilots flying better aircraft. A pilot did not need to be an ace to survive and contribute. He needed to understand his role in the formation, trust his partners, and execute the geometric pattern that made individual vulnerability irrelevant. This democratization was profoundly American in character. The United States, in 1942, was mobilizing an enormous military force drawn from a civilian population that had limited military tradition. Most American pilots were not career military officers from martial traditions, but civilians in uniform, college students, farmers, mechanics, salesmen, who had volunteered or been drafted and then trained as rapidly as possible to meet wartime needs. They could not match the years of experience that Japanese naval aviators had accumulated. But they could learn to fly in formation, to trust their wingmen, to execute disciplined tactical patterns that negated enemy advantages. The weave was a tactic that allowed mass-produced pilots flying mass-produced aircraft to defeat elite warriors, flying superior machines simply by refusing to fight on terms that favored the enemy. This same principle was being applied across every dimension of America's war effort in 1942. American industry was not trying to produce small numbers of exquisitely crafted weapons superior to anything enemies could build. Instead, American factories were producing enormous quantities of weapons that were good enough, aircraft that were robust and reliable rather than high performance, tanks that were adequate rather than exceptional, ships that could be built quickly in quantity rather than slowly in perfection. The strategy was not to match enemy quality, but to overwhelm through quantity, sustainability, and systematic tactical innovation that maximized the effectiveness of mass-produced equipment operated by rapidly trained personnel. The weave was aerial combat's manifestation of this broader strategy. It was a tactic designed for average pilots flying adequate aircraft, and it worked precisely because it did not require individual excellence to be effective. A formation flying the weave was more powerful than the sum of its individual parts. 4 average pilots flying the weave could defeat 6 or 8 elite Japanese pilots flying Zeros, not because American pilots were better individually, but because the tactic itself was superior. This was deeply threatening to Japanese military culture, which placed enormous value on individual martial excellence and treated war as a test of spiritual quality rather than industrial capacity. As 1942 progressed into 1943 and beyond, the weave became increasingly refined. Pilots developed variations for different tactical situations. The basic defensive weave evolved into offensive applications where American fighters would actively seek engagement with Zeros, knowing that their mutual support would protect them in the ensuing combat. Training became more sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from hundreds of engagements. By 1943, American fighter pilots were not just surviving encounters with Zeros, they were actively seeking them out, confident in their tactics and their equipment. The arrival of more advanced American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, shifted the tactical balance further. These aircraft matched or exceeded the Zero's performance in most areas while retaining the armor and structural strength that characterized American designs. But even with superior aircraft, American pilots continued using the weave, recognizing that mutual support remained more effective than individual combat, regardless of aircraft performance. The tactic had become so fundamental to American fighter doctrine that it persisted even when the performance disadvantages that originally necessitated it were eliminated. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, struggled to adapt. Their training continued to emphasize individual dogfighting skill. New pilots, less experienced than the veterans of 1941-42, attempted to engage American fighters using tactics that had been effective early in the war but were now suicidal against weave-flying American formations. Japanese losses mounted catastrophically. The pilot quality that had given Japan aerial superiority in 1941 was steadily attrited away, with experienced veterans killed in combat and replacement pilots inadequately trained due to Japan's limited training infrastructure and diminishing fuel supplies. By 1944, American pilots were facing Japanese opposition that was numerically significant but qualitatively inferior, flown by pilots with minimal combat experience, attempting to employ tactics that American defensive patterns had rendered obsolete. The statistical evidence of this transformation was stark. In early 1942, exchange ratios in fighter combat were roughly even or slightly favored the Japanese. Each side lost similar numbers of aircraft in air-to-air combat. By mid-1942, after the weave became standard American tactics, exchange ratios began shifting to American advantage. By 1943, American fighters were destroying Japanese aircraft at ratios exceeding 3-to-1. By 1944, ratios had reached 10-to-1 or higher in many engagements. This improvement was not solely due to the weave. American aircraft were improving. American pilot training was becoming more effective. Japanese pilot quality was declining, but the weave was fundamental to the transformation. It had broken the spell of zero invincibility and established tactical patterns that maximized American advantages while minimizing American vulnerabilities. The larger strategic implications were equally significant. Control of the air was essential to every American offensive operation in the Pacific. Amphibious landings required air superiority to succeed. Naval operations required fighter protection against Japanese air attack. Strategic bombing campaigns required fighter escort. The weave, by making American fighter formations effective against Japanese opposition, enabled every other aspect of American Pacific strategy. The island-hopping campaign, the destruction of Japanese naval power, the strategic bombing of Japanese cities, all of these operations depended fundamentally on American fighters being able to establish and maintain air superiority. And air superiority depended on tactics that allowed American pilots to defeat Japanese fighters consistently. One could trace a direct causal line from Thatch's Matchstick demonstrations in early 1942 to American victory in the Pacific in 1945. This is not to claim that the weave alone won the war. No single tactical innovation, however brilliant, determines the outcome of a global conflict involving millions of people and nearly infinite complexity. But the weave was an essential link in the chain of causation. It solved a critical problem at a moment when American forces desperately needed solutions. It restored confidence when morale was dangerously low. It provided a template for how American forces could overcome enemy qualitative advantages through systematic tactical innovation, mass production, and organizational adaptation. These were the characteristics that defined American military effectiveness throughout the war, not individual heroism or superior equipment, though both existed, but systematic competence at every level that turned industrial capacity into military power. The matchstick that Thatch rotated between his fingers in early 1942 was more than a teaching tool. It was a physical representation of how problems could be solved through clear thinking, geometric visualization, and willingness to abandon traditional approaches when tradition was demonstrably failing. Japanese fighter tactics in 1942 were traditional. They emphasized individual skill, aggressive pursuit, and dogfighting techniques refined over years of training and combat. These tactics had been effective in China and remained effective against unprepared opponents, but they were not effective against opponents who understood their weaknesses and designed systematic counters. The weave represented a different approach to problem solving, one that was characteristically American in its pragmatism and its willingness to abandon tradition in favor of effectiveness. American military culture in World War II was not constrained by centuries of martial tradition. It could innovate freely because it had no sacred doctrines to preserve. If a tactic worked, it was adopted. If it failed, it was modified or discarded. This flexibility, combined with the resources to implement innovations rapidly across large forces, gave American military organizations an evolutionary advantage. They could adapt faster than enemies whose military cultures were constrained by tradition and ideology. By the war's end, the weave had become so standard that new pilots learned it as fundamental technique, like formation flying or gunnery. It was taught in training squadrons in the United States, practiced in workup training, and employed routinely in combat. The tactic that had seemed complicated and difficult in early 1942 had become instinctive by 1945. And that transformation from innovative solution to standard practice was itself characteristic of how American military forces operated. Good ideas were identified, refined, disseminated, and institutionalized with remarkable speed. The time from Thatch's initial conception of the weave to its adoption as standard fleet tactics was measured in months, not years. In a conflict where the side that adapted fastest had enormous advantages, this institutional capacity for rapid innovation was worth divisions. The Japanese military, by contrast, struggled to adapt throughout the war. Tactical innovations that might have countered American developments were often not implemented because they conflicted with traditional doctrines or because the institutional structure of Japanese military organizations made rapid change difficult. Japanese pilot training continued emphasizing individual dogfighting skill even as combat experience demonstrated that American mutual support tactics made dogfighting suicidal. Japanese aircraft designers continued prioritizing performance over durability even as combat losses demonstrated that unarmored, fragile aircraft were death traps against American firepower. The inability to adapt, to learn from failure, to abandon ineffective traditions in favor of practical solutions was as responsible for Japanese defeat as any material disadvantage. In the decades after the war, as historians and military analysts studied the Pacific Air Campaign, the Thatch weave became recognized as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the conflict. It was taught in military academies as an example of how tactical problems could be solved through systematic analysis and creative thinking. Thatch himself, who survived the war and rose to high rank in the post-war Navy, was celebrated not as an ace who had shot down dozens of enemy aircraft, but as a tactician whose innovation had saved countless lives and enabled strategic success. His matchstick demonstrations became legendary, a reminder that the most important innovations sometimes come not from technology or firepower, but from simple geometric insight applied to practical problems. The 4 Wildcats that first employed the weave in combat, outnumbered and outperformed by enemy aircraft, had demonstrated something fundamental about how wars are won. Individual superiority in equipment or skill is valuable, but not decisive. What matters is the system, the tactics, the training, the mutual support, the institutional capacity to identify what works and implement it broadly. 4 Wildcats flying the weave could defeat superior numbers of Zeros not because individual American pilots were better than individual Japanese pilots, but because the American system of tactics and teamwork was superior to the Japanese system of individual combat. This lesson resonated far beyond aerial combat. It applied to every aspect of the Pacific War and to every aspect of American industrial society. The United States in World War II did not win by producing a small number of wonder weapons or by developing a cadre of superhuman warriors. It won by systematically identifying problems, developing practical solutions, and implementing those solutions across enormous forces with remarkable speed and efficiency. This capacity for systematic problem-solving, more than any specific weapon or tactic, was America's ultimate strategic advantage. The matchstick rotated between Thatch's fingers, crossed with another, separated, rejoined. A simple motion that represented a profound insight that in modern warfare, systematic cooperation was more powerful than individual excellence, that tactical innovation could overcome material disadvantage, that clear thinking and geometric visualization could solve problems that seemed insoluble through brute force. The Zeros were unbeatable in individual combat, but they could be beaten by pilots who refused to fight individually, who trusted their partners, who executed disciplined tactics that turned enemy strengths into weaknesses. In the end, the Weave was more than a tactical innovation. It was a demonstration of how democratic military forces could defeat authoritarian warrior cultures by embracing principles that democracy embodied: cooperation over individual glory, systematic analysis over tradition, pragmatic adaptation over ideological rigidity. The Matchstick was a symbol as potent as any flag or slogan of American ingenuity applied to the brutal necessities of war. It represented the idea that problems could be solved, that disadvantages could be overcome, that systematic thinking and mutual support could achieve what individual heroism could not. The sky over the Pacific, vast and blue and empty except for the contrails of aircraft locked in combat, witnessed this transformation. It saw Zeros that had seemed invincible, brought down by Wildcats that were supposedly inferior. It saw Japanese pilots, trained since boyhood in martial traditions, defeated by American civilians in uniform who had learned to fight as teams. It saw tradition yield to innovation, individual excellence subordinated to collective effectiveness, and martial culture overwhelmed by industrial democracy. The Matchstick traced its geometric pattern through that sky, and in that pattern was written the outcome of the war, not inevitable, never predetermined, but achievable through clear thinking, systematic adaptation, and unwavering confidence that problems could be solved if approached with rigor and creativity. 4 Wildcats against superior numbers of unbeatable Zeros. The Matchstick rotated, crossed, separated, rejoined. And in that simple motion was encoded the truth that would define the Pacific War, that American forces would win, not by matching Japanese excellence, but by systematically defeating it through tactical innovation, mutual support, and the relentless application of democratic principles to the practice of war. The Weave was geometry made deadly, cooperation transformed into survival, and ultimately a demonstration that, in modern conflict, systematic competence would always overcome individual superiority. That was the lesson of the Matchstick, written in the contrails above the Pacific, proven in combat from Coral Sea to Midway to the Philippine Sea, and validated by the ultimate outcome: American victory and Japanese defeat in a war where tactical innovation proved as decisive as industrial production, and where 4 Wildcats, flying in perfect coordination, could defeat the unbeatable simply by refusing to fight the battle their enemy expected.